research project. I will briefly discuss the theoretical framework of my dissertation, specifically within the context of memory studies, and introduce concepts I will use in this talk, namely needle alienation and prosthetic memory and analogical memory. So finally, I will share and analyze a few poems by three contemporary Pakistani poets, Rizwan Akhtar, Haris Khaliq, and Hima Raza. So contemporary Pakistani poets in the last 2 decades have translated the event of 9/11 and its offshoots into individual, communal, public, prosthetic, and transcultural memories of violence, disturbance of identity, and displacement of cultural metaphor, and determined their own paths to manage the turmoil different from the ones witnessed by the post 9/11 American poets. So, my PhD research project uh, explores the rationalization of the aftermath of 9/11 in Pakistani poetry and examines that how Pakistani poets have chosen to aestheticize the global repercussions of the event. So in my research, I am going to grapple the following questions: that what are the forms of post-memory of 9/11 and its offshoots in Pakistani poetry? And what are the thematic concerns of post-9/11 prosthetic memory in Pakistani poetry? And what are the characteristics of the transcultural turn to post-9/11 memory in Pakistani poetry? So the 9/11 attacks in the US and the subsequent American invasions in Afghanistan and the Middle East left indelible footprints on the global socio-political order. 9/11 and its offshoots have been aestheticized by the American memorials as a traumatic past and accumulate the dust of Twin Towers for social and mythical and national solidarity through poetry, fiction, film, and other forms of literature. So further, the global impact of 9/11 has affected the metaphor of representation in literature of the global South, and in particular in Pakistan. So Pakistani poetry produced in the last 2 decades has attempted to develop the post 9/11 memory that can be interpreted into individual, communal, public, prosthetic, and transcultural terms. The triangulation of this individual and communal and public memories and its aftermath can be witnessed in Pakistani poetry through the representation of violence and displacement of identity in the post 9/11 context. So, building my argument by working through these recent developments in memory studies, the contention of my research is to highlight the rhetoric of difference in post 9/11 Pakistani poetry by addressing the ways individual, communal, and public and prosthetic and transcultural memory of 9/11 and its offshoots are aestheticized by the poets. So the 5 variant forms of memories in this research are put under a portmanteau term post-memory and refers to the chains of memories approaching 9/11 and its aftermath. Unlike Marianne Heath's use of the term in the context of intergenerational memory, the parenthesized post of post memory refers to the space where my research engages with the memory studies theoretically on the rhetoric of difference through which the poets construct post 9/11 poetic memorials in Pakistan, and more precisely, the difference between post memory and memory is the difference in poetic responses that imagine 9/11 and its impact in Pakistani literature. So, in other words, within the canvas of this research, the parenthesized post provides the theoretical space to the diversity of Pakistani poetic vices to 9/11 and its offshoots. So my research this way conceptualizes its theoretical canvas by entwining concepts across memory studies and cultural studies and builds its argument upon the four concepts. So most post-colonial, critics argue that the English language as the colonizer's language is foreign to the post-colonial language. And Derrida questions the very originality of the language in its autobiographical account of his relationship with the French language. And he believes that every language is a colonial language, since the speakers of that language see their language as a possession and as such more precious than the other languages. So in monolingualism of the other, Derrida writes, when I said that the only language I speak is not mine, I did not say it was foreign to me. So Derrida's interpretation of monolingualism develops an ironical critique upon the relationship of post-colonial subjects with their languages and its use. So another way around, Derrida's ironical attitude towards monolingualism can also be elaborated uh, through the very use of his term aporia, an internal irresolvable conflict towards deciding the foreignness and the colonial nature of the language that does not relate easily to the cultural or historical origins. So I argue that very conflict raises as an aspect of creativity among the post-colonial writers that makes them write freely without predetermining their political roles or recalling the colonial past of the English language. So most post 9/11 Pakistani poets, particularly Anglophone ones, return the memory of violence, turmoil, and cultural displacement and identity crisis to the global audience and using English language not simply as a medium of communication, but as a kind of post-colonial irony. So these are, I mean, public. These are the selected works. Drawing upon the framework developed within the field of post-memory studies. These are the works I have selected for my research that include both Anglophone Pakistani poetry and poetry translated from Urdu. So the national language and also the indigenous language from peripheries of Pakistan. And moving towards moving towards the question on language, because of the poem and this that is the My Languages by Rizwan Akhtar is one of the such poem that is a kind of a very striking example that reflects the post-colonial irony of writing in English language and then that laments upon the loss of ancestral, national, and indigenous languages at the same time. And the poet also highlights this idea in the ending lines, if you can see, that I am often prisoner and custodian, straddles with its fortunes, falling and running across the English Channel. So coming towards the poetry analysis, Pakistan Meets a Terrorist by Rizwan Akhtar. Rizwan Akhtar was born in Lahore and did his PhD from the University of Essex in 2013. And currently he is assistant professor in the Department of English at the University of Punjab, Lahore. His main area of teaching is South Asian literature in English, and his research interests involve around uh, post-colonial memory, crime fiction, adaptation studies, and modern aesthetics. So Akhtar's poem, Pakistan Meets a Terrorist, is from his recent collection, Lahore I Am Coming, that's published in 2017. So this poem is full of metaphors of violence and chaos, like peeled and hooked bodies, ripped and lines, pelleted syntax, cities full of fear. Polyphonic nature of these metaphors enlarges the very canvas of capturing forms of violence in Pakistan right after 2001. And his poem shares a kind of a collective memory of violence encompassing 9/11 and 7/7 London bombing, and then revisits them beyond their historical and geographical borders by connecting them with the present. So I will discuss this poem in the light of prosthetic memory, the way it casts needle alienation upon history and the act of re-experiencing it. Theoretical frames of prosthetic memory in the post 9/11 era develop a link between the commodification of culture and the politics of memory. And apart from Landsberg's optimistic coverage of prosthetic memory, it is significant to see how a prosthetic memory erases the original or experienced past or overlaps it with the crafted and unexperienced past, and partially or completely. So this function of prosthetic memory in Orlando Patterson's world is needle alienation that disconnects the individuals from their historical memories. And tracing these kinds of features in the available text of post 9/11 Pakistani poetry is very useful to understand that how prosthetic memories overlap original pasts with the artificial ones, experienced with the unexperienced ones, lived with the unlived, and the reals with the imagined ones. So these memories give an individual a prosthetic past, and this remembering comes at the cost of forgetting more immediate cultural pasts. So, with this prosthetic bond, transcending time and space, the memory of 9/11 in this poem is needily alienated the way Akhtar tries to equate the violence happening across the world and in Pakistan in the last 2 decades. And this attempt helps to understand the nature of polyphonic 9/11 memory beyond any national or spatial borders. For example, the second line of the poem, "We live through them each moment," develops a trans-historical and transnational memory of violence. And following up the third line, "Every day rehearse a dumb show," emphasizes the frequency of transmitting memory threads that are subscribing more chaotic syntax every day. So Akhtar's poetry helps us understand the prosthetic framing of Pakistani social and national consciousness after 2001. In the sixth and the fifth last couplet, in the TV footages, virtual reconstructions, thrice removed from the reality, and cameras run through smoke as ghosts, find a way of communication. Akhtar points out that media and technology has played its part in deconstructing 9/11 memory and transporting it beyond the national borders and facilitating its transnational acquisition across the world, including Pakistan. So this poem helps in understanding the way 9/11 is turned into a transcendent memory for the global South, circumscribed simultaneously by cultural forgetting. Next poem is the Magician and the Boy, Waziristan by Haris Khaliq. So Haris Khaliq is a leading Urdu and English language poet from Pakistan with 8 collections of verse. During the 1980s and 1990s, some of these poems faced censorship as well. He is the University of Iowa Honorary Fellow in Writing and has spoken widely on themes straddling culture, politics, and human rights. So Khalik's poem, The Magician and the Boy Waziristan, is from his collection No Fortunes to Tell, published in 2019. And this poem is based on a dialogue between a magician and a boy after a bomb blast in Waziristan. So Waziristan is in northwestern Pakistan. I mean, is the northwestern part of the Pakistan that is bordering Afghanistan and has been subjected to the thousands of airstrikes, including by drones since 2001. So tens of thousands have fled the bombing and have become refugees in their own country. So the poem talks about a boy who carries her mother's dead body and requests the magician to reconstruct her mother's body, which is cut in half, and bring her back to life the way he has cut down the bodies in half and connected them back in the show, the circus show. So understanding this poem helps us to understand the magnitude of violence, chaos, and turmoil in Waziristan. So I will discuss this poem in terms of mnemohistory and the way it subscribes to prosthetic memory. Mnemohistory is a concept that Marek Tom talks about in cultural memory analysis to help us to understand the function of history in memory studies. So the understanding of mnemohistory is based on the understanding of relationship of history and memory and the role of cultural memory in understanding that relationship. So to Tom, history and memory are two different things. Since history for him is representing a specific event in the past. However, memory refers to the study of past in relation to the present in a very specific socio-cultural context. But history contributes to the production of cultural memory by giving an account of religion, literature, and the myths of a certain time and space. So mnemohistory is to look at history as a cultural memory by asking a question at what is known for the past in the present, and why is it that some versions of the past dominate over the others. So this poem tells us the ways the memory of violence altered the memories of music, culture, and art in Waziristan. When I talked to Haris Khalid about the thought process of this poem, he said that he did not refer to any specific event in the past since he's a poet. And his work is not about writing history or representing the past. So having no specific historical reference, Khalik's poem, The Magician and the Boy, has a more effective interpretation of violence through the metaphorical language in the poem, like the boy covered in dust and smell, carrying her mother's body in a cumbrous sack that's hard for him to handle in the harsh winter, and finding his mother's body among the charred ones that is not fully burned and still recognizable. So in terms of mnemohistory, the effective language creates a prosthetic memory that, though an artificial one, still cultivates a surge for hope, solace, and a messiah in this time of despair among the people living in the peripheries of Pakistan. The palm reader Aleppo, Haris Khalik's is another poem. That's the first poem in his collection, No Fortunes to Tell. So this poem reflects the memory of prosecution and suffering. In the title, Palm Reader is the poet himself who retrieves the past by revisiting an unknown place that has the traces of genocidal destruction. Aleppo is a city in Syria that is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world. And the city may have been inhabited for 6 millennium BC. So it is one of the striking examples of medieval Islamic architecture preserved into the 21st century. And the poem itself does not narrate any specific historical event, but the act of remembering in the poem resonates with the erasure of memory and deterritorialization of Muslim cultures. Analyzing this poem in terms of analogical memory helps to understand the retrieval and recollection of painful past that Emily Catley and Michael Pickering refers to in their work, and responds to an experience of irrevocable loss of Muslim culture, art, and aesthetics that the Muslims are experiencing in the present world after religious fundamentalism. So, analogical memory constructs similarities between diverse experiences and events, and comparing the magnitude of violence that 9/11 and the downfall of Aleppo carry manifest a kind of transcultural experience of demise and lamentation across the global south and the global north. So, I mean, by assigning himself the role of a palm reader, dwelling back into the memory of violence, full of scattered fresh corpses, looking for their fortunes and discovering none, and coming up with their fate that is not less than an epoch of hopelessness and despair. The poet develops a link between past and present through this analogical frame of memory the poem shares. And these analogical frames construct suffering and chaos, transcending their time and space. So Hima Raza and her poetry. So Hima Raza was a poet, critic, and academic scholar, and she was born and brought up in Lahore and graduated from Kinnard College, Lahore, and she earned degrees from University of New South Wales, Australia, and University of Sussex, England. So Raza taught English literature and creative writing at different universities in Lahore and London, and she published two collections of her experimental poetry, Memory Stains and Left Hand Speak. And she died at the age of 27 in 2003 in an accident. So she developed an experimental style of poetry that is unconventional and that unfolds in a non-linear fashion, but still marked by the slight notes of nostalgia, disturbance of identity, and displacement of culture. So her poetry prioritizes structure over words to contribute to the meaning making process. And structure may be a design, a picture, or texture. So her experimental poetry blurs the distinction between word and image and challenges the linearity and structures of writing a poem. So the poem idea of you that's on the left side of the slide is from her collection Left Hand Speak, published in 2003. And it has random words across all the corners of the page, having no parent connection, and seems conveying and capturing that very spontaneous and non-linear thought process of mind. So also Raza gives a more personalized account of you that seems to address the reader, turning them into a subject in the poem. It involves the reader as an active participant in the meaning making of the poem. And reader is not just a passive, but an active agent who makes the meaning of the poem by himself. So this kind of poetry echoes the consciousness of a decentered subject that is questioning its own ontology as a human. And it is more haphazard, having multiple thoughts at one time. I mean, in the poem, there is one protagonist who is unable to think, And since there is no beginning and ending of the poem, so there is no connection between lines. I mean, we may say that Himaraja's experimental poetry plays with coherence. So it can be started from any corner of the page. And simultaneously, like thinking about life and death, building and breaking a relationship, entering and exiting a world of love and hate. It represents a complex and patternless, incessant vices that may belong to the poet or the reader, and making meaning into what I said at the left bottom of the screen. You may see there are two more phrases pointing to each other: more than a lie and less than a promise. And above them, on the most left side, there is another phrase: control the commitment. So these things help us in recognizing the relationships and reconciliation, as lacking in inherent structure of the poem. So significant difference in eliciting post 9/11 memories in Pakistani literature and the world literature is connected to the modalities of remembering the past. I mean, precisely through post memory, I attempt to state that trauma is not the only pivot to trace what has been embedded in language by Pakistani indigenous and diasporic poets. Since rather than connecting us with the accurate memories, trauma is in fact displaces the original memories and makes them ineligible to be accessed by us efficiently. And Emily Catley and Michael Pickering also challenge the reliability of trauma. So through their article Painful Pasts, they argue that trauma is not only the source of remembering past in memory studies, since trauma is more amnesiac rather than memorial, an experience of loss that can disrupt the remembering process. So Himaraja's work pushes 9/11 post memory beyond the poetic narrative structures of other poets into the realm of the unpresentable and hence the unrecallable. So, so there are a few other poems who have the same structure, and they are the most striking examples of Himaraja's experimental poetry. So I would like to conclude my talk with Himaraja's poem Us in Two Tones. Her poem, written in two different languages, is a one sided dialogue with her beloved. This bilingual poem begins in English with slightest notes of lamentation at the moment of separation. And then the poem drifts to her mother tongue, Urdu, that acknowledges her hope for their reunion with reference to the famous folklore of Laila and Majnu. So, writing this poem in two languages, Hima wants her beloved to understand that the part of her that he cannot understand, since Urdu is a language foreign to him. So, the Urdu part of her poem is more subtle in its tone and recitation. So the translation of the poem does not work as the same way, but Dr. Nida helped me to capture that. And I will recite the Urdu verses in both ways, from left to right and then right to left. And then you will be able to recognize the very cusp of two cultures intertwined with their separate languages, echoing both absence and presence, despair and hope. So, here is the Urdu part of the Himaraza's poem that you have seen earlier, and here is the translation that Dr. Donanida Saji just made. So I'm going to recite the Urdu part, and you will probably be looking at the English version on the screen. कौन मजनू and को और कौन मजनू और कहाँ लैला इस जलती रेत की सदा में तेरी दिल फेंक हंसी मेरी अनकही दुआ फिर ये बेनूर बेगवाह सितारों की थकन जहां तुम्हारी तमन्ना वहां मेरी तपस्या तेरी याद पे बिछाई आज मैं अपने गम की चादर कि अगर तुम मुझे भूल गए हो तो मेरे बंद हाथों की खुशबू शायद तुम्हें मेरी तंग गली के खामोश कूचों की तरफ फिर ले आए. So now moving towards the other version, I mean, reciting the same poem, but from right to left, and then we change the position of the sentences in English as well. And that's here. तेरी याद पे बिछाई आज मैं अपने गम की चादर कि अगर तुम मुझे भूल गए हो तो मेरे बंद हाथों की खुशबू शायद तुम्हें मेरी तंग गली के खामोश कूचों की तरफ फिर ले आए वहां मेरी तपस्या जहां तुम्हारी तमन्ना फिर ये बेनूर बेगवाह सितारों की थकन मेरी अनकही दुआ तेरी दिल फेंक हंसी इस जलती रेत की सदा में कौन मजनू और कहाँ लैला. So with Hima Raza's words of unrequited love, but also of hope for a more perfect union, I end this talk. And once again, I want to thank the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, Dr. Christine Marin Allison, Dr. Nida, and Dr. Sabadeep, Dr. Martha, for their indelible support in making this talk and my visit to the USA possible, and a memory beyond the forms of memories we have discussed today to stay with me for the rest of my life. So thank you all for joining me today.